Before the roads cut through the wilderness, before maps were filled in, before the West was truly understood, there were men who chose to go into the wild, not for days, not for weeks, but for years. They weren't soldiers, they weren't settlers, they were trappers, mountain men, living on the edge of survival. And for them, the wilderness wasn't something to conquer, it was something to endure. Imagine waking up before sunrise. There's no alarm clock, no warm bed, no roof overhead, just cold air biting at your skin and the faint crackle of a dying campfire. You slept on the ground, wrapped in animal hides, maybe a blanket if you were lucky. Everything you owned was within arm's reach: your rifle, your knife, your traps. Out here, those weren't just tools. They were the difference between living and dying. The Rocky Mountains stretch endlessly around you, silent, vast, unforgiving. A place where one wrong decision, one bad storm, one empty stretch of land could be the end. And yet, this is exactly what these men chose to be and do. Most mountain men came west chasing for opportunity. In early 1800s, beaver fur was worth a fortune. Back east and across the Atlantic, beaver hats were in high demand. Soft, waterproof, durable, a symbol of status. And behind that demand were companies like the American Fur Company. But while fortunes were made in cities, the real work was done out here, in the freezing rivers and the dense forest. The trapper's day didn't just start with comfort, it started with movement. You had to keep moving because the land didn't wait for you. Beavers lived along rivers, streams, so that's where you had to be. You set traps carefully, metal jaws hidden beneath the water, anchored in place. Then you'd moved on, sometimes miles at a time, setting more. By the time you finished, you could have dozens of traps spread across the landscape. And then came the waiting game. The next day you returned, one by one, checking each trap. Sometimes you'd find a beaver, other times nothing. Or worse, a trap has been torn loose and tracks nearby, which is a sign of something stronger, something more dangerous had gotten to it first. Because you weren't alone out there. Wolves followed movement, mountain lions watched from a distance, and grizzly bears, they didn't watch, they charged. One of the famous mountain men, Hugh Glass, learned that the hard way. He was attacked by a grizzly bear, mauled so badly that the men traveling with him believed he wouldn't survive, and so they left him, alone, broken, bleeding, hundreds of miles from safety, and somehow he lived, crawling, dragging himself across the wilderness, driven by something deeper than fear: survival. That kind of danger wasn't rare. It was a part of the daily life of a fur trapper. Because out there was no rescue, no second chances. If you made a mistake, you could pay for it. And then there was the hunger that followed. Food wasn't a guarantee. Some days you ate well, fresh game like deer and elk, cooked over an open fire. Other days you went without. You learned to adapt, to find whatever land offered. Berries in the summer, roots dug from the ground, fish pulled from icy streams, and when nothing else was available, you relied on pemmican, a dense mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries. It didn't taste good by any stretch of imagination, but it lasted for a long time. More importantly, it kept you alive. Water wasn't always safe either. Rivers carried more than just fish. So you learned quickly where to drink and where not to drink, because getting sick out in the wilderness could be a death sentence. Then came the winters, long, silent, brutal. Snow would fall without warning, burying trails, covering tracks, cutting you off from everything. Temperatures dropped so fast it felt like the air itself could freeze your lungs. Fires became lifelines. You guarded them, protected them, because if your fire went out in the middle of the night, you might not wake up. Shelters were basic, sometimes a crude lean-to, sometimes nothing at all, just the open sky and whatever you could wrap around yourself. Animal hides, blankets, anything to trap the heat. And then there was the isolation, weeks, months, sometimes years without seeing another person, no conversation, no voices, just wind, water, and silence. Some men thrived in it, others didn't. Because the hardest part of this life wasn't always physical, it was mental. But once a year, everything changed. The solitude broke, the silence ended, and the mountains came alive. A sight unlike anything else. Annually, they would get together for trade. Hundreds of trappers, traders, and Native Americans meeting in one place. After months and sometimes years. This was civilization. Furs were traded, supplies were restocked, gunpowder, lead, tools, and clothing, everything you needed to survive another year. But it wasn't just business, it was a release. Stories were told, laughs were echoed across campfires, and for a brief moment these men weren't surviving, they were living. Whiskey flowed freely, maybe sometimes too freely, because for many, this was the only break from life that demanded everything. And then just as quickly as it began, it ended. Fires burned low, the camps emptied, and one by one the mountain men disappeared back into the wilderness. But their world wasn't empty. The West already was home to Native American tribes who knew the land better than any outsider ever could. Some trappers built relationships with Native Americans. They traded with them. They learned survival skills. Even some married into the tribes. Others weren't so fortunate. Tension would build. There would be misunderstandings, competition for resources. It sometimes turned violent very fast. Because out there, the territory mattered, and survival didn't leave much room for trust. Still, despite everything, there was something about this life that pulled men in. The freedom, the true freedom. No cities, no expectations, just you and the land. Every decision mattered. Every action had consequences. And every day you survived was something you earned. But nothing lasts forever. By the 1840s, everything began to change. Fashion shifted. Beaver hats fell out of style. Silk replaced fur, and just like that, the demand collapsed. The fur trade, which was the business of the mountain men, started to disappear. Some mountain men adapted. They became guides leading settlers west along the trails that they helped discover. Others tried to settle down and leave the wilderness behind. But many couldn't, because once you've lived in that kind of life, it just doesn't leave you. The mountains changed you and the silence changed you. The struggle just became of who you were. And as more settlers moved west, building towns, roads, railroads, the wilderness began to shrink, and the world of the mountain men that we knew, wild, untamed, endless, slowly faded. But their legacy didn't, because these men did more than trap beaver. They explored the unknown, mapped rivers, found passes through mountains that would later become roads for a growing nation. Men like Jedediah Smith helped open the West, not the armies, but the endurance. And maybe that's what makes stories like Fur Trappers so powerful. They weren't chasing glory. They were trying to be remembered. They were just trying to survive, one day at a time, in a world that didn't care if they lived or died, because the truth is, the life of the mountain man wasn't romantic, it wasn't easy, it wasn't forgiving. It was cold, dangerous, and lonely, but it was real. And for a brief moment in history, it was everything. A life most people couldn't endure, and a life that helped shape the world as we know it today. Until next time, see you in the next video.